Imagine the medieval world at dinner time. In a smoky cottage on the edge of a village, a peasant family huddles around a clay pot, dipping coarse hunks of dark bread into a watery pottage of onions, cabbage, and a few scraps of fat. Meanwhile, only a few miles away, inside a stone castle, a noble lord reclines at a great oak table draped with embroidered cloth, where servants carry in a roasted swan, its feathers reattached for display, shimmering with gold leaf to dazzle his guests. These two meals, so different in taste, appearance, and meaning, reveal the very essence of the Middle Ages. Food was not just survival, but a mirror of power and status. The divide between rich and poor was nowhere more visible than at the table. For the peasant, food was about endurance, how to feed a family through the winter, how to stretch the harvest of barley, rye, or oats. For the noble, food was performance. Each dish served was not only meant to satisfy hunger, but to proclaim wealth, authority, and sophistication. A nobleman who placed a gilded peacock upon his table declared to all who saw it, "I am powerful enough to waste, while others starve." To understand medieval food, one must first understand this hierarchy. It was not simply a question of taste. The laws of the land, game laws, guild restrictions, and even church decrees dictated what one could and could not eat. Hunting deer or wild boar was a privilege of the nobility, enforced by blood if necessary, while peasants caught stealing rabbits could be mutilated or killed. Access to meat, sugar, or spices was not a matter of money alone, but of rank. And yet hunger was universal. The same sun that ripened the noble's vineyards also scorched the peasants' fields. Famine swept through both castle and cottage, though with vastly different results. A failed harvest might mean hunger for a lord, but death for his serfs. In this way, food was both sustenance and weapon, for whoever controlled the grain controlled the people. Religion also shaped this world of contrasts. On fast days, the church forbade meat, pushing nobles and peasants alike toward fish, eggs, or dairy, but the rich twisted the rules. A noble might dine on lampreys simmered in wine, or beaver tail deemed fish by clever clerics, while a peasant settled for dried herring or none at all. The table was a battlefield of morality, where obedience and indulgence clashed daily. Yet, despite this stark division, the peasant and noble were bound together through food. The peasant toiled in the fields, planting, harvesting, and grinding grain that filled both his family's pot and his lord's pantry. The noble consumed not only for himself, but to maintain the illusion of endless abundance that upheld his rule. Food was currency, reward, punishment, and display all at once. This contrast was not lost on medieval minds. Chroniclers often marveled at the excess of the rich, describing feasts where dishes arrived in towers of sugar, meats sculpted into beasts of fantasy, or entire animals cooked whole. At the same time, records of poor households show how families survived on bread so coarse it damaged their teeth, or on broths so thin they were closer to flavored water than nourishment. The same word, meal, meant vastly different experiences depending on where one sat. The medieval table, therefore, was more than a place to eat. It was a stage, a symbol, and a constant reminder of the world's inequalities. To eat well was to declare one's place in the hierarchy. To eat poorly was to be reminded of one's place beneath it. And so every loaf of bread and every gilded roast told a story, not just of taste, but of power. If there was one food that united the medieval world, it was bread. From the humblest serf to the mightiest king, bread was the foundation of the diet, the daily companion of every meal. Yet, As with so much else in the Middle Ages, not all bread was equal. Its color, texture, and even its flour told the story of wealth, survival, and status. For peasants, bread was often dark, coarse, and heavy, while for nobles it was white, soft, and refined, a visible measure of the gulf between classes. Peasant bread was made from rye, barley, oats, or whatever grain could be coaxed from the soil. In good years, it was a solid, if unremarkable, loaf. In bad years, it could be mixed with peas, acorns, or ground-up bark to stave off hunger. The dark loaves, dense and sour, filled bellies but offered little luxury. For peasants, bread was not a choice but a necessity, consumed in vast quantities because it was filling and cheap. To go without bread was to go without life. Noble bread, however, told another tale. Made from finely sifted wheat flour, it was pale, soft, and prized. White bread, known as manchet, was costly and labor-intensive to produce, demanding finer milling and higher quality grain. At feasts, trenchers, thick slices of stale bread, were even used as plates, soaking up the juices of roasted meats and sauces before being discarded to the poor or the dogs. Bread in the hands of the rich became not just food, but a symbol of refinement and excess. The symbolism of bread extended far beyond the table. In times of famine, bread riots erupted across Europe. Peasants broke into bakeries, accusing millers and lords of hoarding grain or fixing weights. To cheat a customer with underweight bread was a serious crime, and bakers caught doing so were punished harshly, sometimes forced to carry their fraudulent loaves through the streets as a mark of shame. Bread was too important to be treated lightly, for it was the very foundation of survival. Religion, too, gave bread a sacred role. In the Christian Mass, bread was transformed into the body of Christ, turning a humble loaf into a vessel of salvation. This added a spiritual dimension to a daily staple. To break bread was not only to feed the body, but to touch the divine. Even the poorest peasant knew this symbolism well, for no meal, however meager, escaped the shadow of the Church's teachings. Yet bread was not always reliable. Harvests failed, grain prices rose, and famine forced desperate measures. Chronicles record years when people ground ferns, beans, or even straw into their dough to create famine bread. These loaves were bitter, indigestible, sometimes even poisonous. To eat such bread was to taste despair. The very food that symbolized life could become a cruel mockery of survival when nature or politics turned against the people. Despite its dangers, bread endured as the medieval lifeline. It was present at every table, whether black and heavy or white and refined. It accompanied soups, meats, and cheeses, and it was carried into fields by workers who wrapped it in cloth for their midday meal. In castles, it bore the juices of venison and swan, later thrown away with disdain. In cottages, it was cherished, each crumb carefully saved, each loaf stretched as far as possible. Bread was never just bread in the Middle Ages. It was identity, power, and faith baked into a crust. Its presence defined meals, and its absence spelled disaster. To understand medieval food, one must begin with the loaf. Humble or grand, dark or white, sacred or profane. It was the thread that wove together peasant and noble, hunger and feast, earth and heaven. If bread was the lifeline of the Middle Ages, meat was its luxury, desired, flaunted, and fiercely controlled. To eat meat often was to declare wealth, for it was not merely nourishment but a privilege guarded by law and tradition. For the vast majority of peasants, meat was rare, sometimes absent altogether from their diet. For nobles, however, it was a daily indulgence, a symbol of their status, and a tool of spectacle at feasts. The divide between those who dined on venison and those who gnawed on scraps was one of the starkest contrasts of the medieval table. For peasants, meat was usually reserved for special occasions, a feast day, a wedding, or the slaughter of an animal before winter. Pork was the most common, often salted or smoked to last through lean months. A thin strip of bacon fat might flavor an entire pot of pottage, giving the illusion of richness where little existed. Poultry, too, was sometimes eaten, but most chickens were more valuable for their eggs than their flesh. Beef and lamb were rare for the poor, as these animals were the wealth of the Lord, not the food of his serfs. Nobles, by contrast, feasted on a dizzying variety of meats. Venison, hunted in vast royal forests, was a delicacy reserved for kings and their favored lords. Boar hunts were dangerous but prestigious, the spoils roasted whole and paraded before banquet guests. Nobles dined not only on domesticated animals, beef, lamb, and fowl, but also on wild game: deer, swan, heron, and even crane. Exotic meats like porpoise and whale sometimes graced noble tables, transformed by spices into dishes meant to impress as much as to satisfy. The right to hunt was a jealously guarded privilege of the nobility. Royal forests were vast, and strict game laws forbade peasants from hunting deer, boar, or rabbits. To be caught poaching was to risk brutal punishment, mutilation, imprisonment, or death. Yet hunger drove many to risk it. Chronicles tell of men hanged for stealing a deer, or of families fined beyond ruin for setting traps in forbidden woods. The forest was as much a symbol of oppression as of bounty, its wealth reserved for the few while the many starved. Preservation shaped much of medieval meat consumption. For nobles, fresh meat was readily available, but for peasants, salted pork or dried fish was more common. Salt, an expensive but vital commodity, turned pork into ham, beef into jerky, and fish into stockfish that could last through the year. Smoking, too, kept meat edible, though it hardened the flesh and intensified its saltiness. For the poor, these preserved meats were eaten sparingly, often in small shreds to season stews. Religion also dictated the rhythms of meat. The church imposed fast days, nearly half the year, when meat from land animals was forbidden. Fish, however, was permitted, leading to an explosion in medieval fishing and trade in salted herring. For nobles, these days were no hardship, for they could afford lavish fish dishes, salmon in sauces, lampreys baked in pies, or eels stewed in spices. For peasants, it was often dried or pickled fish, cheap but monotonous. Even here, the contrast remained. Meat was more than food. It was performance. At noble feasts, entire animals were roasted and presented whole, sometimes disguised in elaborate displays. Peacocks roasted, then redressed in their feathers, boars' heads stuffed with herbs, even pies that opened to release live birds in a display of wealth and whimsy. Guests were meant to marvel, to remember that their host commanded enough resources to turn sustenance into spectacle. Meanwhile, the peasant family shared a bone-scraped bear or a pot flavored by a sliver of salted pork. For them, meat was not spectacle, but survival, and its absence left hunger gnawing through the long winters. This divide between hunger and abundance, survival and extravagance, was perhaps never so cruelly displayed as at the medieval table, where the smell of roasting venison drifted from castle halls, while peasants scoured fields for snails and hedgehogs to eat. To dine in the halls of the medieval aristocracy was to step into a theater where food became art, spectacle, and sometimes grotesque display. Nobles did not merely eat. They performed their power with dishes designed to astonish, shock, and intimidate. These meals were less about nourishment and more about demonstrating wealth, mastery of resources, and the ability to command luxuries that most people could scarcely imagine. And often, the dishes themselves were as strange as they were extravagant. One of the most bizarre noble delicacies was the roasted swan. Considered a regal bird, the swan was not only cooked, but redressed in its feathers, sometimes gilded with gold leaf to glitter beneath the hall's torchlight. Guests gasped as the shimmering creature was carried into the feast, a symbol that the host could turn nature itself into ornament. The taste, however, was less impressive, tough, oily, and far from pleasant. But in the medieval world, flavor mattered far less than spectacle. Peacocks, too, were served in similar fashion. They were roasted, then carefully sewn back into their brilliant plumage so that they looked alive, their tails fanned wide across the table. Chroniclers describe them as awe-inspiring sights, more sculpture than meal. Eating them was secondary. The true feast was the visual proof of luxury. In some cases, nobles even gilded the beak and claws of the bird, transforming it into a glittering trophy before it was carved. But noble taste went beyond birds. At times, the wealthy indulged in foods that today would seem unthinkable. Whale meat and porpoise occasionally appeared on the tables of the rich, especially during Lent when they were classified as fish by the church. Hedgehogs were sometimes baked into pies, their prickly hides singed off, then presented as curiosities. Even beavers, especially their tails, were considered a fasting delicacy, further blurring the line between religious observance and indulgence. Another strange fascination was with jellies and aspics. Nobles dined on meats and fish suspended in shimmering gelatin, sometimes dyed with bright herbs or saffron. These wobbly creations were expensive, time-consuming, and visually striking, proving that the household had both the means and the labor to craft such novelties. Guests did not marvel at the taste, but at the effort, for to mold food into art was to demonstrate dominance over nature and servants alike. The use of sugar, a rare and costly import, gave rise to even stranger creations. Entire sculptures of sugar, castles, animals, even lifelike human figures were displayed at banquets. Some were edible, others purely decorative, but all were statements of wealth. To waste sugar in this way, when most peasants had never tasted it, was a calculated gesture. A reminder that the host lived in a world of abundance, while others starved. Not all noble foods were so exotic, but even ordinary meats were transformed into shocking displays. A banquet might feature pies filled not only with meat, but with live birds, so that when the crust was cut, the birds flew out to the astonishment of the guests. Dishes were disguised as something else entirely. Fish shaped to look like meat, meat carved to resemble fruit. Surprise was a crucial ingredient in aristocratic cuisine. For peasants looking on, these strange dishes must have seemed like sorcery. While they gnawed coarse bread and boiled turnips, the nobility feasted on gilded birds and jellied fish, on creatures of sea and sky remade into theater. The gulf between hunger and abundance, simplicity and extravagance could not have been wider. And yet, for the nobility, such excess was not foolish waste. It was a language of power, meant to be seen, remembered, and feared. While nobles reveled in gilded birds and exotic meats, the peasants' table told a far humbler story. For the vast majority of medieval people, food was not spectacle, but survival, a daily struggle to fill the belly with whatever the land, the season, or sheer luck could provide. Their meals were repetitive, simple, and often monotonous, but they carried the weight of endurance, keeping millions alive through hardship and hunger. At the heart of the peasant diet was pottage, a thick stew of whatever vegetables, grains, or scraps were available. Into the pot went onions, cabbages, leeks, beans, peas, and sometimes turnips or parsnips. If a family had a sliver of bacon fat, it was dropped in to lend flavor, clinging to the broth like a rare luxury. The pot was often kept simmering for days, with new ingredients added as old ones were eaten, a living stew that changed constantly, yet never entirely disappeared. Bread, coarse and dark, accompanied every meal. Made of rye, barley, or oats, it was dense and filling, though sometimes sour. In times of shortage, peasants stretched their flour with whatever they could grind: beans, chestnuts, acorns, even ground-up ferns or bark. Such famine bread was bitter, hard to digest, and sometimes poisonous. Yet in desperate years, it was the difference between life and death. Meat was rare, often reserved for feast days or special occasions. When animals were slaughtered, little was wasted. Intestines became sausages, blood was turned into puddings, and bones were boiled for broth. Fish, especially salted herring, was more common, carried inland from coastal towns in great barrels. Even so, a diet heavy in fish and salted pork left peasants longing for freshness that rarely came. Milk, butter, and cheese were more frequent sources of protein, though most cows and goats were too valuable for their milk to be sacrificed for meat. Seasonality ruled the peasant diet. In summer, gardens burst with vegetables, berries, and fresh greens. In autumn, grain was harvested, and animals slaughtered for winter storage. But in winter, the diet shrank to preserved foods: salted pork, smoked fish, dried beans, and whatever root vegetables could be dug from storage pits. By early spring, the hungry gap, supplies dwindled, and families often faced their hardest months, when the promise of new crops was close but not yet real. Alcohol was another staple, for water was often unsafe. Ale, brewed at home by women, was weak but nourishing, consumed daily even by children. Stronger beer was a luxury, but small ale sustained laborers in the fields. Cider and mead appeared where apples and honey were plentiful, though wine was largely beyond reach, reserved for nobles and monasteries. Drink, like food, reflected the gulf between classes. Hunger was a constant companion. Famines swept across medieval Europe with terrifying regularity, triggered by failed harvests, harsh winters, or war. In these times, peasants ate grass, roots, or whatever they could scavenge. Chronicles speak of desperate families boiling nettles or chewing on boiled animal hides. To live through a famine was to know the cruel edge of survival, where food became a memory rather than a meal. And yet the peasant diet, however simple, was not without joy. Harvest festivals brought shared meals of bread, cheese, and ale. Weddings might see a pig roasted, the smell drifting across the village. Holy days brought relief from monotony, even if only in the form of sweetened pastries or a joint of meat. For peasants, food was not abundance but resilience, the art of making little last long, of finding flavor in scraps, and of keeping hope alive through hunger. If bread and pottage were the staples of the medieval poor, then spices and sugar were the jeweled treasures of the noble table. To sprinkle saffron into a sauce or grind pepper over roasted venison was to proclaim wealth as loudly as a golden crown. These luxuries, carried on perilous trade routes from distant lands, transformed food into symbols of status and power. In the Middle Ages, spices were not simply ingredients, they were currency, spectacle, and sometimes obsession. Pepper was the king of spices, so valuable it was used as a form of payment. Merchants demanded peppercorns in exchange for goods, nobles hoarded them in locked chests, and chroniclers record dowries and rents paid in the tiny black grains. To flavor a dish with pepper was to flaunt a fortune, for a handful of the spice might equal a laborer's monthly wage. Cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg followed close behind, their fragrances filling banquet halls with exotic allure. Saffron, the dried threads of a fragile flower, was perhaps the most ostentatious of all. Its brilliant golden color turned humble rice or broth into a shimmering display of wealth. Nobles dyed sauces and breads with saffron, not for taste alone, but because its dazzling hue whispered of trade routes stretching to the Far East. To serve saffron was to declare one's connections, influence, and ability to command the riches of the world. Sugar, too, entered Europe as a rare marvel, arriving from the Arab world by way of Mediterranean traders. Far from the cheap sweetener it would later become, sugar was treated as a spice, a medicine even, sold in small lumps or ground into powder. Nobles sculpted it into castles, animals, and even lifelike human figures, presented as dazzling centerpieces at banquets. To waste sugar in such extravagant forms, while peasants had never even tasted it, was a deliberate reminder of privilege. The spice trade itself was perilous and costly. Caravans carried goods from India and Arabia across deserts and mountains, through lands plagued by bandits, pirates, and war. Venetian and Genoese merchants dominated the trade, their ships unloading cargoes of pepper, cinnamon, and sugar into European ports. By the time these luxuries reached a noble's table, their price had multiplied 100-fold, each grain of pepper carrying with it the weight of entire empires. For peasants, spices were largely out of reach. At most, they might taste mustard seeds or local herbs like sage, garlic, or parsley, flavors grown in cottage gardens rather than carried across the seas. Their food was earthy, honest, and repetitive. But for nobles, spices turned meals into journeys, exotic tastes binding them to a wider world that peasants could only imagine. A noble banquet was as much about global connections as it was about food. Even medicine absorbed the allure of these imports. Doctors prescribed cinnamon to strengthen the stomach, cloves to freshen breath, and sugar mixed with herbs as a cure for fever. To consume these goods was to claim not only refinement, but health, as though wealth itself could guard against sickness. The poor, by contrast, relied on garlic, onions, and bitter herbs, healing themselves with what the fields and hedgerows provided. In the end, spices and sugar were more than food. They were symbols of medieval Europe's hunger for the extraordinary. They told stories of distant lands, of perilous journeys, of merchants who gambled fortunes on the winds of the sea. To taste them was to taste power itself, for only the wealthy could afford to turn the sweat of distant labor into a sprinkle on their feast. And so, in every golden broth and sweetened tart, nobles proclaimed what mattered most, not sustenance, but status. In the medieval world, what one ate was not only determined by wealth and harvests, but also by the hand of the church. Food was not merely nourishment, it was a spiritual matter, bound up in sin, salvation, and obedience. Rules about fasting and feasting carved deep lines into the rhythm of daily life, shaping diets for both peasants and nobles. In a time when faith governed every aspect of existence, the kitchen and the chapel were never far apart. The church imposed strict fasting laws, forbidding meat from land animals on nearly half the days of the year. Wednesdays, Fridays, and the 40 days of Lent were the most significant. but additional holy days expanded the calendar further. On these days, no beef, pork, lamb, or poultry could pass the lips of the faithful. Instead, the faithful turned to fish, eggs, dairy, and vegetables. Yet even here, loopholes flourished, for the human appetite is cunning when pressed against the wall of doctrine. Fish became the great equalizer of fasting. For the poor, this meant salted herring, pickled eels, or whatever could be caught in local rivers and ponds. For the wealthy, however, the seas delivered luxury. Salmon baked in pastry, lampreys stewed in wine, or sturgeon served with saffron sauce. The distinction between peasant and noble persisted, even in shared obedience. To dine on fish was mandatory, but the kind of fish revealed who you were. Some interpretations of religious law bordered on the absurd. Beavers, for instance, were classified as fish because they lived in water and had tails resembling scales. Monks feasted on roasted beaver tails during Lent, while peasants gnawed dried herring bones. Similarly, barnacle geese, thought in some regions to grow from driftwood, were declared acceptable as fish. These curious rulings reveal not just ignorance of biology, but a deep medieval need to reconcile appetite with piety. The aristocracy, as always, stretched rules to their advantage. Wealthy households employed cooks who turned fasting days into feasts, crafting elaborate dishes of almond milk, fish molded into the shapes of animals, or pastries filled with fruits and spices. The poor, meanwhile, endured monotony: pottage without the luxury of meat, bread without the comfort of butter. The letter of the law was observed, but the spirit often bent beneath the weight of privilege. Beyond fasting, the Church also condemned gluttony as one of the 7 deadly sins. To eat too much, too lavishly, or too often was considered sinful, a moral failing that imperiled the soul. Yet nobles continued to stage extravagant banquets, their tables groaning under mountains of food, while monks in cloisters quietly debated whether second helpings of stew violated their vows. Food was always tied to morality, a battleground where desire clashed with duty. For peasants, these rules added another layer of hardship to already lean diets. Fasting did not mean a great sacrifice when one had little meat to begin with, but it did enforce monotony and deepen hunger in the hardest seasons. Still, obedience was crucial, for to defy the Church's laws risked not just social shame, but eternal damnation. Meals became quiet acts of devotion, each bite taken under the watchful eye of heaven. Thus, the medieval table was never free. Every loaf of bread, every fish, every strip of meat carried with it questions of faith and obedience. What was forbidden, what was allowed, what was stretched into strange loopholes, all of it revealed the strange dance between appetite and doctrine. In the end, food was not only about survival or status, but about salvation itself, a daily reminder that the road to heaven ran straight through the stomach. In the medieval imagination, food was never just food. It was medicine, a force that shaped health, temperament, and even destiny. Physicians trained in the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen taught that the body was governed by the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that diet was the key to keeping them in balance. Every meal, whether a noble banquet or a peasant's pottage, carried not only flavor, but medicinal weight. To eat was to heal, or to risk falling into imbalance. Foods were classified by qualities: hot or cold, moist or dry. Beef, for example, was considered heavy and melancholic, tending toward cold and dry, while chicken was lighter, warmer, and easier to digest. Pork was thought dangerously moist and prone to excess, while fish was cold and damp, suited only for some temperaments. Even bread was analyzed. White wheat bread was light and nourishing, while coarse rye was heavy and potentially harmful if consumed in excess. Thus, diet was a kind of prescription, tailored to a person's humor. Nobles had the luxury of choice, allowing physicians to craft diets according to their constitutions. A melancholic lord might be urged to eat warming spices, lamb, and sweet wines. A choleric knight, hot-tempered by nature, might be prescribed cooling fruits, cucumbers, and dairy. Peasants, by contrast, had little choice. Their diet was dictated not by physicians, but by necessity, and so they lived with imbalance, soothed only by herbs gathered from hedgerows. Herbs and spices bridged the gap between kitchen and apothecary. Garlic was prized for its ability to cleanse the blood and ward off sickness. Onions were believed to sharpen vision and cure headaches. Sage was said to prolong life, while rosemary strengthened memory. Parsley, mint, and dill all appeared as remedies in both humble homes and noble courts. What grew in the garden might fill both the pot and the medicine chest, a testament to the blurred line between food and healing. Sweet foods carried their own medicinal weight. Honey, far more common than sugar, was not only a sweetener but an antiseptic, applied to wounds or mixed with vinegar to soothe throats. Sugar, when available, was treated as a drug as much as a delicacy, prescribed to restore strength or calm the stomach. Almond milk, a staple in noble fasting diets, was praised for its gentleness, seen as easier on the digestion than cow's milk. Every luxury, it seemed, wore the mask of medicine. Drinks, too, were tied to health. Ale was considered nourishing and safer than water, while wine was prescribed to balance humors, mixed with herbs, or diluted with water according to one's condition. Warm spiced wine, known as hippocras, was said to aid digestion after heavy meals. Even vinegar was recommended as a tonic, cutting through excess and restoring harmony. To drink was as much an act of healing as of pleasure. Yet medieval medicine was often as dangerous as it was helpful. Some physicians prescribed extreme diets to purge the body, starving patients into weakness. Others recommended bizarre cures, like roasted owl for gout, or broth made from fox lungs for respiratory ailments. For the poor, folk remedies prevailed: nettle soup to cleanse the blood, elderberry wine for colds, or raw garlic to ward off plague. Whether noble or peasant, people clung to the hope that food could heal where medicine often failed. Ultimately, food and medicine were inseparable in the medieval mind. To eat well was to maintain harmony of the body and soul. Each bite carried meaning, each herb a whispered promise of health. And though their understanding of the body was far from modern science, medieval people believed deeply in the healing power of the table. In their world, the path to wellness was not through a physician's chamber alone. It was through the hearth, the garden, and the plate. If the peasant's table spoke of endurance, then the noble's feast was a stage of glory. Medieval feasts were more than meals. They were political statements, theatrical spectacles, and demonstrations of wealth and power. To be invited to a feast was to enter a world of pageantry where every dish, every song, every goblet of wine carried meaning. Feasts marked coronations, victories, marriages, and holy days, binding communities together with ritual and excess. A great feast began long before the guests arrived. Weeks of preparation filled the kitchens, animals slaughtered, barrels of ale brewed, spices measured in precious ounces. Cooks labored over massive hearths, turning spits heavy with oxen or deer, while bakers prepared intricate pies, some filled with meat and others designed to conceal live birds or frogs for a shocking surprise when cut open. Servants bustled, polishing silver and setting long trestle tables with trenchers of bread, cloths, and knives. When guests entered the hall, they were met by music. Minstrels strummed lutes, trumpets blared, and heralds announced the arrival of lords and ladies. Tapestries hung from the walls, candles glowed in iron chandeliers, and rushes strewn across the floor were freshened with herbs to sweeten the air. The feast was not just about eating. It was about spectacle, the transformation of the hall into a world of wonder. The courses themselves were overwhelming in number and variety. A noble feast might include roasted swan redressed in its feathers, gilded boars' heads stuffed with herbs, jellied fish molded into towers, and delicate pastries sweetened with sugar. Saffron-turned sauces golden, and cinnamon-perfumed roasted lamb. Between courses came subtleties, marzipan castles, sugar sculptures, or dishes shaped to look like something else entirely. The message was clear. Here was a host so wealthy that even food could be art. Entertainment threaded itself between the dishes. Jongleurs performed acrobatics, jesters cracked jokes, and troubadours sang songs of love and war. Sometimes trained animals were brought forth, or knights staged mock combats in the hall itself. Each performance reinforced the sense of abundance and control. Guests were not merely fed. They were dazzled, reminded of the host's ability to command not only resources, but also spectacle. Yet beneath the extravagance lay politics. To feast one's vassals was to bind them in loyalty. To entertain visiting nobles was to display strength and hospitality. A poor feast might shame a lord, casting doubt on his wealth or power. A grand feast, by contrast, secured alliances and impressed rivals. The table was a stage upon which power was negotiated, each dish a piece in the game of prestige. For peasants, feasts appeared only on the margins. They might be granted scraps from the lord's table, or invited to village festivals at harvest time. Their feasts, though humbler, were no less joyful. Bread and ale shared in community, a pig roasted over the fire, dancing that lasted until dawn. Though their fare lacked saffron and sugar, the spirit of celebration was as rich as any noble banquet. Feasts were moments of release, when hunger and hardship gave way to laughter and song. Ultimately, feasting in the Middle Ages was about more than food. It was about memory. Guests left with full bellies, but also with stories of wonder, of golden birds and sugared castles, of music that filled the rafters and wine that never ran dry. For a brief moment, the world was abundance, and the host, like a king in his own realm, ruled not just with sword and crown, but with bread and salt, with meat and wine. For all the magnificence of noble feasts, the medieval world was haunted by a constant shadow: famine. The abundance displayed in castle halls was fragile, built upon harvests that could fail, wars that could disrupt trade, and weather that could turn against mankind. For peasants, famine was not an abstract fear, but a recurring nightmare, a brutal reminder that survival itself was precarious. The most infamous famine struck in the early 14th century, between 1315 and 1317, when relentless rains drowned crops across northern Europe. Grain rotted in the fields, livestock sickened in the mud, and stores from the previous year dwindled to nothing. Chroniclers describe people eating cats, dogs, and even the flesh of the dead. Prices of bread soared beyond reach, and thousands perished, their bodies buried in mass graves. This catastrophe etched itself into memory, teaching a cruel lesson. Food was never guaranteed. Even in less dire years, scarcity was common. The hungry gap in early spring, The period between the exhaustion of old stores and the arrival of new crops was dreaded. Families stretched their meals thinner, surviving on cabbage leaves, dried beans, and whatever roots could be scavenged from the earth. Malnutrition took its toll. Children stunted in growth, weakened immune systems, and an endless cycle of vulnerability to disease. Hunger was not only physical, but generational, leaving its mark on entire villages. For peasants, famine bread was both a necessity and a humiliation. To bulk out flour with acorns, peas, or ground bark was to acknowledge defeat before hunger. Such bread was heavy, bitter, sometimes poisonous, yet it filled the belly when nothing else could. Chronicles speak of people baking loaves from bean flour or chestnuts, their coarse texture tearing at the mouth. Each bite was a grim reminder that plenty had vanished, and survival demanded sacrifice. Meanwhile, the nobility weathered scarcity with far greater ease. Grain stores were locked in castle granaries, meat preserved in salted barrels, and wealth allowed them to import what peasants could not even dream of. Famines deepened the gulf between rich and poor, for the sight of nobles feasting while peasants starved became sharper in such times. Riots and revolts often followed, with starving peasants breaking into bakeries or demanding justice from lords who guarded their stores too closely. The church, too, played a role in famine relief, though its efforts were uneven. Monasteries sometimes opened their granaries to feed the hungry, distributing bread to those in need. Yet the moral teachings of the time often framed famine as divine punishment, a scourge sent by God to correct human sin. This belief weighed heavily on the starving, who not only battled hunger, but also the fear that their suffering was a sign of heaven's wrath. Scarcity also reshaped culture. Families learned to preserve food more carefully, to pickle vegetables, smoke meats, and dry beans for storage. Villages held tightly to communal fields and shared harvests, knowing that survival often depended on cooperation. Even feasts in peasant villages took on a bittersweet quality, for abundance was fleeting, and every harvest could be the last before hunger returned. The cycle of feast and famine was as old as the soil itself. In the end, famine was the great equalizer, though never in equal measure. It humbled lords and peasants alike, reminding them of nature's supremacy, yet it crushed the poor far more brutally. For all the wealth of spices, sugar, and feasts, the medieval world remained at the mercy of the harvest. And in this, perhaps, lay the greatest truth of the Middle Ages, that food was never simply a meal, but a mirror of life itself. Abundance and hunger, joy and despair, survival and death, all bound together in the fragile crust of bread.